One of the experiments you did, you put one of your antenna in a compost pile. Before we get to how that worked, what if I just
It's a
take,
model I make that goes in a compost pile.
okay, a
Yeah,
compost pile model. What if I just take
CW3. Yeah.
steel pry bar, shove it into my compost pile? Am I getting some beneficial effect, do you think?
With the steel, with the iron, I would say no, because iron demagnetizes soil.
What
And
about a
part of the reason
copper
we
pipe?
copper pipe, if it's coming up out of the ground for a distance, you might be harnessing a little effect if it's reaching the ground and going through the pile
Okay,
and making contact with the ground. You need a ground.
right. So I cut you
And
off.
that
Sorry. Why?
pile would basically become a ground too, but the more ground, the better. Deep in the earth is a good ground. In a compost pile above the surface is not a good of a ground is good of a ground in electrical science.
Why not iron?
Well, iron over time, all these steel and iron implements that have been used in agriculture actually demagnetizing the soil and making it less inclined to magnetism, which is less paramagnetic, more diamagnetic. Therefore, it doesn't have the cation exchange capacitance that it once did because the soil naturally exchanges electricity with the atmosphere. This we know. I mean, this we know. So when the soil is at a higher paramagnetic level altogether, it's drawing more of that in on its own. The antennas are like a mega booster of that. And then you're running that wire into the rhizome layer. So you're getting some deeper effect with that by far. But part of building the highly capacitory soil with high capacitance rather, is that it's going to interface with the atmosphere on its own to a level too. And that's what Phil Callahan wrote a lot about in his book, Paramagnetism. Great book if you're into that field. Um,
Yeah. Is this, I don't know if you ever read the book. There's a book like titled something like Irish Round Towers.
yeah, that's Phil Callahan,
Is that
same
essentially
guy.
what these were?
Yeah, those were basalt
Electromagnetic vectors?
towers. Those are
Yeah.
basalt towers, right. So those were paramagnetic rocks. Now, interestingly enough, the science of paramagnetics, um, when you combine diamagnetic rocks in rings and stacks, they have the potential to become paramagnetic. This definitely is in the realm of elemental transmutation. Like Rudolf Steiner called those things spiritual digestion in the soil, what I'm speaking of, the transmutation of elements. That's where the word alchemy comes from, from the word alchemit, and it's referring to the soils of the Nile Delta that would transmutate elements and how dark and rich it was. And that's where the word comes from. It's an agricultural word meaning the flux of elements, polarities.
And for people listening to this, I'm going back in memory here. But so in Irish Round Tower, the whole idea about it was you had these strange towers across the Irish countryside
Mhm.
that seemingly had no purpose. That, wasn't like a lighthouse. It's not to protect from invaders
Not a
or hide.
silo. Yeah.
Yeah, and like, why are these things here? And the rough theory was like you could fill them to different levels with some material. I forget what that was. And that could essentially tune them to a
Yes.
frequency to get the benefit of something like we're talking about
Salt.
today.
Yeah. Or a paramagnetic rock. Other rocks too. Other rocks other than basalt are most certainly paramagnetic. That's just the one we use the most.
Was
Yes, that's exactly right. That's Phil Callahan's book. I'm almost certain that was his book. He definitely wrote about these Irish round towers a lot, and that's the theory that they were used to harness paramagnetic energy. They're basically a large rock antenna.
was Electroculture in The Secret Life of Plants, the movie or the
I
book?
I don't know. I did not see or read that.
Okay.
I don't know.
Because
I would
that's one
imagine
thing.
it. You would think it would be.
I mean, they had a lot of stuff in their radio frequency, and I think round towers might have been mentioned in there. I'm pretty sure Phil Callahan's work was talked about in there.
Okay.
That's what thing that kind of got me interested in some of this stuff, like going back to like 2005. There's the book, who was written in 1973. There's a
Yeah.
movie, 1979, something like that. So if somebody wants a entertaining introduction to some of this stuff, that's one place to look.
Yes. And Harvey Lyle wrote some good books for this too.
Okay. So we got some name.
Enlivened rock powders.
Yeah, I think I've read that one or
Good
had that one
book.
around
Yeah,
here.
good book.
The experiment you did putting it into a compost pile, how do you think that worked?
Well, it works well. I mean, it's the same theory. So that model that I make is specifically designed to connect to a copper grounding rod, which goes through a compost pile or windrow and then contacts the ground for its negative point. And that's just a way to use that same principle to go ahead and enliven your compost. So for instance, if you take basalt rock, which is dark gray, and you put it in the compost, you'll notice that naturally after maybe 2 months or so that you'll see white rock there because it's turned to nascent lime. It's an electrically charged, newly birthed nascent lime. That's a very powerful material. That's doing what people use lime to do, but on a much more efficient level because this is flux polarities and become an enlivened rock powder, not an inert rock powder that you might buy in a bag. It's the difference between fresh food and highly processed food. We know they have different values of energy, like anything. So when you add the antenna, you just get much quicker transmutation. So you might see that powder turn from gray to white in like 3 weeks. And that's the experimental nature, perhaps, of the observation. But what I'm doing in that case of that video is just applying the principles of electroculture to my compost pile so that it's a very active pile as I apply it to the soil. We're just going to go ahead and start enlivening this compost that we're adding to the soil so that it's doing its job even more efficiently. And that model I created, the CW3, for that exact purpose. So you could keep an antenna in your compost pile. And since it's not mounted high, like at 25 feet in the troposphere, there's not nearly as many like free electrons or free ions. So I have two tensor rods coming out, one counterclockwise, one clockwise for balance. They are the same length exactly of one sacred cubit, and one looks smaller than the other because it's set down into the body slightly more, but they're the same length. And those two rods are creating piezoelectric current into the ground, into the wire that connects to the ground rod, instead of the atmospheric bundle, which would be more for a pole mounted higher up mount. So we're just trading out different forms of electricity, and copper being a great material to use for piezoelectric current. Tensor rods, the technology of Slim Sperling, who was an Appalachian fellow at Light Life Technologies, and tensor rods was his whole line of work. You can go read about it. Slim Sperling, great individual.
Why 25 feet up for the antenna? Is there anything special about that number?
That's just about where you start interacting with the troposphere, and there's more free electrons and ions to collect there because they're not grounding out with the Earth's negative. When you get close to around 15 feet, that attraction is high and they start grounding out, especially if your ground is very paramagnetic, which is great in your gardens, but we're just collecting that into a unit that's going to send them, current goes from positive to negative. So collecting the positive, it's going to flow to the negative, and that's going to flux back and forth and induce the voltage. And that principle, I keep bringing it up, but it's so important because that's how all life works,
So,
literally.
so if you have a two-story house, you can put it on the roof, and you're pretty close.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, you could put it on a roof as long as you can run that wire down through insulators and stuff like that, not making contact with wood or metal, and or insulate your wire to the point of the ground is fine too. Using insulated wire is an option.